The telegram arrived in the morning. Elizabeth Harper had finally decided to stop waiting for miracles. She stood in the empty schoolhouse of Cedar Falls, Montana, watching dust motes dance in the September sunlight that streamed through windows. She'd cleaned just yesterday. The building felt cavernous without the voices of children, without the scratch of chalk on slate, without the rustle of pages turning in well-worn primers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the yellow paper, though she already knew what it would say. The school board's decision had been unanimous, delivered with the cold efficiency that small towns reserved for casting out their unwanted. Services no longer required. Vacate premises by October 1st, 1887. Board regrets this necessity. Regrets. Elizabeth almost laughed at the word, but the sound caught in her throat like a sob. They regretted nothing except having hired her in the first place, a woman whose husband's gambling debts had become the town's favorite scandal even 3 years after his death in that Denver alley. She folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into her worn leather satchel, the same bag that had carried her teaching materials across 7 states in the past decade. Always moving, always hoping the next town would be different, that her credentials from the Teachers' College in Boston would matter more than whispered rumors about her late husband's failings. The schoolhouse door creaked behind her. Elizabeth didn't turn around. She'd heard that particular footstep pattern too many times in recent weeks. Hesitant, guilty, but determined. Mrs. Harper. Margaret Walsh's voice carried the peculiar mixture of sympathy and relief that marked those who delivered bad news they secretly welcomed. "I trust you received the board's message." Elizabeth finally turned. Margaret Walsh stood in the doorway, her black dress impeccable despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in Cedar Falls. The banker's wife had never liked Elizabeth, though she'd been careful to hide her disapproval behind a veneer of Christian charity until recent events made such pretense unnecessary. "I did, Mrs. Walsh. Thank you for your concern. The board wishes you to understand that this decision wasn't made lightly. However, with the irregularities discovered in your late husband's business dealings and the unfortunate incident with the Peterson boy's accusations," Elizabeth's jaw tightened. The Peterson boy, 17 years old and angry at receiving a failing grade in mathematics, had spread lies about improper conduct during after-school tutoring sessions. Lies that might have been dismissed if Elizabeth's reputation hadn't already been tarnished by her association with Daniel Harper's gambling debts and mysterious death. "There were no irregularities in my teaching, Mrs. Walsh. The Peterson boys' allegations were investigated and found baseless. Nevertheless, the appearance of impropriety in these matters," Margaret Walsh's voice trailed off with practiced delicacy. "Surely you understand the board's position. Cedar Falls is a God-fearing community with high moral standards." High moral standards. Elizabeth had heard that phrase used to justify everything from refusing to pay her full salary to excluding her from church social gatherings. Apparently, being widowed by a man who owed money to the wrong people was a moral failing that tainted everything she touched. "Of course," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I wouldn't want to compromise Cedar Falls' sterling reputation." If Margaret Walsh detected the sarcasm, she chose to ignore it. "The stage to Billings leaves tomorrow morning. I'm sure a woman of your education will find suitable employment elsewhere." Elsewhere. Always. Elsewhere. Elizabeth had taught in cow towns and mining camps, in settlements so new they barely had names, and in established communities that thought themselves sophisticated. In each place, she'd been the strange woman with the Eastern accent and the husband who died under questionable circumstances. In each place, she'd eventually worn out her welcome. After Margaret Walsh departed, Elizabeth remained alone in the empty classroom. 23 desks, arranged in neat rows, a blackboard that still bore faint traces of yesterday's arithmetic lesson, shelves lined with books she'd purchased with her own meagre savings. Tomorrow, another teacher would stand in this space, probably some fresh-faced girl from the East who hadn't yet learned that good intentions and superior education counted for little when measured against gossip and prejudice. She began packing methodically, wrapping books in brown paper, rolling maps carefully to prevent creasing. Each item represented years of scrimp and saving, small luxuries purchased when she could afford them. The complete works of Shakespeare bought with her first month's salary in Cheyenne. A set of mathematical instruments acquired in Salt Lake City when she'd briefly entertained hopes of teaching older students. A globe that had cost her 2 weeks' worth of dinners, purchased in desperation when her students in Tucson couldn't locate their own territory on a map. The afternoon wore on, marked by the gradual progression of shadows across the wooden floor. Elizabeth worked in silence, years of practice making the task efficient, if not painless. By evening, her entire professional life was reduced to 3 trunks and 2 carpet bags, ready for tomorrow's journey to another town, another school, another inevitable disappointment. As darkness fell, she walked to the boarding house where she'd rented a small room for the past 2 years. Mrs. Brennan, the proprietor, waited in the parlor with the particular expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Mrs. Harper, I'm afraid I'll need your room by the end of the week. My nephew is coming to work at the bank, and family obligations, you understand." Of course, even her lodging was being stripped away, ensuring she had no choice but to leave Cedar Falls immediately. Elizabeth nodded without surprise. She'd expected this final indignity. "I'll be departing tomorrow, Mrs. Brennan. Thank you for your hospitality." In her small room, Elizabeth sat at the worn writing desk and composed a letter to her sister in Philadelphia. Grace had married well, a prosperous merchant who owned a small fleet of cargo ships. She'd extended invitations before, carefully, worded offers of a home and security. Elizabeth had always declined, clinging to her independence and her profession like lifelines in a storm. "Dearest Grace," she wrote, her pen moving slowly across the paper, "I find myself once again in need of a fresh start. The position in Cedar Falls has concluded, and I believe it may be time to consider your generous offer of hospitality. Perhaps Philadelphia holds opportunities that the frontier has not provided." She sealed the letter carefully, knowing it represented surrender. At 34, she was admitting defeat, returning east with nothing to show for a decade of struggle, except a collection of books and a reputation that seemed to precede her wherever she went. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the promise of winter already sharp in the October air. Elizabeth stood on the platform of Cedar Falls' modest train station, her luggage arranged around her like a fortress. The eastbound stage wouldn't arrive for another hour, but she'd risen early, unable to remain in the boarding house where Mrs. Brennan's nephew was already measuring her former room for new furnishings. Other passengers waited nearby. A traveling salesman with a sample case covered in hotel stickers, 2 women in expensive traveling clothes who whispered behind their gloved hands, a family with 3 small children who were already restless despite the early hour. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the particular shame that clung to widows of questionable character. The sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their mounts moving with the easy gait of animals accustomed to long distances. Even at a distance, something about their appearance set them apart from the usual traffic through Cedar Falls. Their clothes were well made but worn, their bearing alert in a way that suggested familiarity with danger. As they drew closer, Elizabeth could make out more details. The lead rider was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with steel-grey hair severely pulled back and eyes that seemed to catalogue every person on the platform. Her companions were younger men, both armed with revolvers worn low on their hips, in the manner of those who expected to use them. The riders approached the platform directly, their horses' hooves echoing on the packed earth. Conversations died as other waiting passengers sensed something significant in their arrival. The woman dismounted with fluid grace, her gaze scanning the assembled group before settling on Elizabeth with unmistakable recognition. Elizabeth Harper? Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, with an accent that suggested origins in the deeper South. Elizabeth straightened, every instinct warning her of danger, despite the woman's civilized appearance. "Yes, I'm Mrs. Harper. My name is Catherine Reeves. I represent certain business interests that have a need for your particular skills." The phrasing was carefully neutral, but Elizabeth caught the subtle emphasis on business interests. Around them, other passengers had begun to edge away, sensing undercurrents they didn't understand, but instinctively feared. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake," Elizabeth replied carefully. "I'm departing Cedar Falls this morning. My teaching position has concluded." Catherine Reeves smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I'm aware of your recent difficulties with the school board. Most unfortunate, particularly given your exemplary qualifications. Harvard Graduate School, wasn't it, prior to your marriage?" The casual mention of her educational background, information that few people in Cedar Falls possessed, sent a chill through Elizabeth. This woman had researched her, sought her out deliberately. The implications were unsettling. "What exactly do you want, Miss Reeves?" "Mrs. Reeves," she corrected gently, "and what I want is to offer you employment. Better compensation than you've received in Cedar Falls, certainly. More security than you're likely to find elsewhere, given the circumstances that seem to follow your career." One of her male companions had begun casually examining the other passengers, his presence clearly making them uncomfortable. The family with small children gathered their belongings and moved toward the far end of the platform. The traveling salesman suddenly discovered urgent business inside the station building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elizabeth recognized a carefully orchestrated intimidation, though she couldn't determine its purpose. What sort of employment? Tutorial services. Private instruction for someone who has recently recognized the value of a proper education. Catherine's tone remained conversational, but her eyes held an intensity that suggested this was far more than a simple job offer. The position would require travel to a somewhat remote location, but I assure you the accommodation would be comfortable. Remote location, travel with armed escorts, private tutorial services for someone whose identity couldn't be revealed on a public platform. Elizabeth's mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. "I'm afraid I must decline. As I mentioned, I have other arrangements." Catherine Reeves glanced pointedly at Elizabeth's modest luggage, her worn traveling dress, the carefully darned gloves that spoke of genteel poverty. "Do you? Forgive my directness, Mrs. Harper, but my understanding is that you have few options remaining. The position I'm offering represents a genuine opportunity." "An opportunity for what exactly?" "To practice your profession without the interference of narrow-minded school boards. To teach someone genuinely eager to learn, rather than reluctant children sent by parents who view education as an unwelcome necessity." Catherine's voice warmed slightly, as if she were discussing something close to her heart. "To be valued for your knowledge, rather than judged for circumstances beyond your control." The offer was tempting in ways Elizabeth didn't want to acknowledge. After years of struggling against prejudice and suspicion, the prospect of working with a willing student was almost irresistible. But everything about this encounter felt wrong. The timing, the armed escorts, the careful vagueness about the position's requirements. I need more information before I could consider such an arrangement. Naturally. However, such information can only be shared in private, away from... Catherine glanced meaningfully at the other passengers, who were now clearly eavesdropping despite their attempts at discretion. Away from curious ears, the eastbound stage appeared on the horizon, a cloud of dust marking its approach. Elizabeth felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. In 15 minutes, she could board that stage and begin the journey back to Philadelphia, back to dependence on her sister's charity and the slow death of dreams deferred. Or she could take an enormous risk with a woman whose very presence suggested danger. The compensation, she heard herself ask, $500 paid in advance, additional payments of $200 monthly for the duration of the position. Catherine named a sum that represented more money than Elizabeth had earned in the past 2 years combined. $500. Enough to establish herself anywhere, to rent decent lodgings and purchase proper teaching materials. Enough to regain some measure of independence, even if this particular position didn't work out. It was more money than most teachers saw in a lifetime. How long would this position last? That would depend entirely on the student's progress and your mutual satisfaction with the arrangement. I anticipate a minimum of 6 months, possibly considerably longer. 6 months at $200 monthly plus the $500 advance. Over $1,000 total, a fortune by her standards. Elizabeth tried to imagine what sort of student would require such expensive private instruction. What sort of employer would offer such generous terms for tutorial services? The stage was approaching rapidly, its driver already beginning to slow. For the Cedar Falls stop, decision time was measured in moments now, not minutes. Where would this position be located? Approximately 3 days' ride south of here, in territory that's somewhat unsettled. But as I mentioned, the accommodations would be comfortable and you would be perfectly safe under our protection. Unsettled. Territory, protection, armed escorts. Every rational part of Elizabeth's mind screamed warnings, but desperation had its own logic. What did she have to lose, really? Her reputation was already destroyed, her career effectively finished. The prospect of returning east as a dependent relative held no appeal. I would need guarantees regarding my safety and the terms of employment. Naturally, all such details would be discussed privately, and you would have my personal assurance of complete protection. Catherine's smile became more genuine. I think you'll find the arrangement quite satisfactory, Mrs. Harper. The stage pulled up in a cloud of dust and creaking leather, its driver calling out the stop. Other passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to board. Elizabeth looked at her carefully packed trunks, at the ticket in her hand that would carry her back to a life she'd never wanted. Mrs. Harper. Catherine's voice was patient but expectant. Elizabeth folded the ticket carefully and placed it in her reticule. I accept your offer, Mrs. Reeves, though I hope I won't regret this decision. Catherine's smile broadened. I believe you'll find it quite the opposite, Mrs. Harper. James, help Mrs. Harper with her luggage. We have a long ride ahead of us. As Elizabeth's belongings were transferred from the stage platform to pack horses, she caught glimpses of the other passengers' expressions, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and relief that whatever drama was unfolding didn't involve them. The stage departed without her, carrying away her last connection to the life she'd known. Within an hour, Elizabeth found herself mounted on a gentle mare, riding south from Cedar Falls between Catherine Reeves and her silent companions. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by rolling hills and endless sky. Ahead lay unknown territory and an employer whose identity remained carefully concealed. As they rode, Elizabeth reflected on the morning's events. She'd made an impulsive decision based on desperation and an offer too generous to refuse. Catherine. Reeves had known exactly what to say, exactly what amount of money would overcome her reservations. The woman was clearly experienced in persuasion, possibly in other less savory skills as well. But what was done was done. For better or worse, Elizabeth Harper had accepted employment with people whose very presence suggested they operated outside conventional society's boundaries. The next few days would reveal whether she'd finally found the opportunity she'd been seeking, or whether she'd made the most dangerous mistake of her already difficult life. The horses settled into a steady rhythm, carrying them deeper into territory that appeared on few maps and welcomed fewer strangers. Behind them, Cedar Falls continued its daily routine, its citizens already beginning to forget the strange woman who taught their children for 2 brief years. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint possibility of something Elizabeth had almost stopped believing in. A chance to matter, to be valued for what she could do, rather than condemned for what her husband had been. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. Elizabeth adjusted her position in the saddle and prepared for whatever lay ahead. The first sign that Elizabeth had made a terrible mistake came on the 2nd day of travel, when they encountered the burned remains of a homestead tucked into a valley between 2 pine-covered ridges. The blackened skeleton of a cabin stood like an accusation against the brilliant blue sky, its stone chimney rising from ash and debris like a monument to shattered dreams. What had once been a barn was reduced to charred timber and twisted metal. Even the well had been fouled, its wooden cover smashed and the rope cut. Catherine Reeves called a halt without explanation, dismounting to examine the destruction with the thoroughness of someone reading familiar signs. Her companions, James and Samuel, flanked Elizabeth's horse with casual alertness that suddenly felt less like protection and more like containment. "What happened here?" Elizabeth asked, though the knot in her stomach suggested she already knew. "Disagreement over territory," Catherine replied without looking up from what appeared to be boot prints in the hardened mud near the cabin's remains. "Some folks don't take kindly to new settlements in these parts." The euphemism was so transparent, it bordered on insulting. Elizabeth had read enough newspaper accounts of frontier violence to recognize the aftermath of a deliberate attack. This hadn't been random destruction or even Indian raid. It bore the hallmarks of systematic intimidation, the kind designed to send messages to other potential settlers. Were there survivors? Catherine straightened, brushing dust from her riding skirt. The Mueller family relocated to relatives in Colorado, wisely, as it turned out. Her tone suggested the relocation hadn't been entirely voluntary. "Mount up, Mrs. Harper. We have ground to cover before dark." As they rode away from the ruined homestead, Elizabeth found herself studying her companions with new attention. Catherine moved through the landscape with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with its dangers. James and Samuel rode with hands never far from their weapons, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. These weren't mere travelers or even typical frontier guides. They possessed the alertness of predators in hostile territory. The terrain grew increasingly remote as they progressed south. What had begun as rolling grassland gave way to broken country scattered with mesa formations and deep arroyos. The few settlements they passed were little more than collections of rough buildings clustered around wells or creek crossings, populated by hard-faced men who watched their passage with unconcealed suspicion. At one such settlement, barely large enough to merit a name, Catherine stopped to purchase supplies, while Elizabeth remained mounted between her watchful escorts. The brief conversation with the store owner was conducted in tones too low for Elizabeth to overhear, but the man's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching fear as Catherine spoke. Money changed hands, though Elizabeth couldn't determine whether for supplies or something less tangible. "Everything all right?" James asked as Catherine returned to her horse. "Words already spreading about our passenger," Catherine replied, glancing meaningfully at Elizabeth. "We'll need to adjust our route accordingly." Elizabeth felt ice forming in her stomach. "What word? I don't understand." Catherine studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. "There are people in these parts who take keen interest in the movement of unusual individuals. A Harvard-educated teacher traveling under our protection would naturally attract attention." "What kind of attention?" "The expensive kind," Samuel spoke for the first time since their departure from Cedar Falls, his voice carrying an Arkansas drawl. "Folks who deal in information mostly, sometimes in people." The casual mention of human trafficking sent a chill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the October wind. She was beginning to understand that her generous salary reflected not just the value of her services, but the danger associated with accepting them. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they made camp in a box canyon that offered excellent defensive positions, but only one exit. Catherine's men established watches with military precision while she prepared a surprisingly elaborate meal over a carefully shielded fire. The domesticity of cooking contrasted sharply with the martial preparations surrounding it. "You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into," Catherine observed as they ate beans and salt pork off tin plates. Elizabeth saw no point in denying the obvious. "The thought occurred to me. Good means you're not completely naive." Catherine poured coffee from a blackened pot, the liquid strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us, Mrs. Harper. Lives depend on discretion in our line of work." "Our line of work." Elizabeth noted the inclusion, though she'd hardly agreed to anything beyond teaching services. "I'm listening." Catherine sipped her coffee, organizing her thoughts. "The man who requires your services operates outside conventional society's boundaries. He's built something significant in territory that most maps don't acknowledge exists, but his success has attracted unwanted attention from federal authorities." Federal authorities. Marshals, primarily, though there are rumors of Pinkerton involvement as well. Catherine's expression hardened. "Your employer has concluded that education might provide certain advantages in dealing with such attention. The ability to read complex legal documents, for instance, or to correspond with influential people without betraying one's background through crude language or poor penmanship." The picture was becoming clearer, though Elizabeth wasn't sure she wanted to see it complete. "This man is an outlaw. That term carries considerable bias, Mrs. Harper. What constitutes lawlessness depends entirely on whose law you're referencing." Catherine's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd given the subject considerable thought. "In territory where federal authority exists only on paper, local authority tends to emerge naturally. Sometimes that authority conflicts with distant bureaucrats who've never set foot in the region they claim to govern." It was a sophisticated justification for what sounded like organized crime, delivered with the polish of someone accustomed to making complex arguments. Elizabeth found herself grudgingly impressed despite her growing alarm. What exactly does this man do? He provides services that the federal government either can't or won't provide. Protection for settlers against hostile elements, fair prices for goods in regions where legitimate merchants fear to operate. Resolution of disputes in areas where judges and sheriffs exist only in theory. The euphemisms were elegant, but Elizabeth could translate them easily enough. Protection services meant vigilante justice or outright extortion. Fair prices likely involved controlling trade through intimidation. Dispute resolution probably meant summary execution of anyone who challenged this man's authority. And he wants to learn to read. Catherine's smile held genuine warmth for the first time since their meeting. Oh, he reads quite well already, Mrs. Harper. What he lacks is the sort of education that commands respect from people with power, the kind of polish that turns crude frontier leaders into figures worthy of negotiation rather than elimination. You want me to turn a criminal into a gentleman? I want you to provide a good man with tools he needs to protect the people who depend on him. Catherine's voice carried an edge of steel. The question is whether you're capable of seeing past prejudices. About what constitutes legitimate authority? Elizabeth stared into the fire, watching flames dance over seasoned wood. Everything about this situation screamed danger, yet she found herself intrigued despite her fear. The intellectual challenge was undeniable, attempting to educate someone who'd built power through force rather than inherited it through birth or acquired it through conventional channels. How dangerous is this position, really? Less dangerous than remaining in territory where your reputation marks you as prey, Catherine replied bluntly. Your late husband's debts didn't disappear with his death, Mrs. Harper. There are people who view his widow as responsible for settling those obligations one way or another. This was new information, delivered with casual brutality. Elizabeth felt her world tilt slightly as implications sank in. What do you mean? Daniel Harper owed money to men who don't write off debts. They've been patient, hoping you'd eventually accumulate enough assets to make collection worthwhile. Your teaching salary was hardly adequate, but they were content to wait. Catherine's expression grew serious. Recent events in Cedar Falls have convinced them that patience is no longer profitable. They're prepared to explore alternative methods of collection. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. Alternative methods? Human trafficking is quite lucrative in certain markets, Mrs. Harper. Educated women bring premium prices, particularly those with your physical attributes. Catherine's matter-of-fact tone made the threat more terrifying than emotional dramatics could have. My employer became aware of this situation and decided intervention was warranted. The generous salary, the urgent departure. From Cedar Falls, the armed escorts. Suddenly everything made sense. This hadn't been a job offer at all, but a rescue operation disguised as employment. Elizabeth was being spirited away from danger she hadn't even recognized. How did your employer learn about this threat? Information is valuable currency on the frontier, Mrs. Harper. Those who survive and prosper make it their business to know what others are planning. Catherine refilled her coffee cup. My employer has a particular interest in protecting educated individuals from exploitation. He considers it wasteful. The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Elizabeth was beginning to understand that direct questions would yield only carefully crafted responses. Catherine revealed information according to her own agenda, not Elizabeth's curiosity. That night, as Elizabeth lay wrapped in blankets beside the dying fire, she listened to the soft conversation of her guards and tried to process everything. She'd learned her husband's gambling debts were apparently more serious than she'd realized, serious enough to make her a target for human traffickers. Her rescue had been arranged by someone with resources and information networks that spanned considerable territory. Someone who valued education enough to invest heavily in acquiring it. Someone dangerous enough that federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives were actively hunting him. The third day brought them into landscape unlike anything Elizabeth had ever seen. Towering red rock formations rose from broken terrain, creating natural fortresses and hidden valleys that could conceal armies. The few trails were barely visible, marked more by absence than presence, subtle indicators that Catherine read with practiced ease. They encountered no other travelers, though Elizabeth occasionally spotted movement on distant ridges that might have been mounted men paralleling their route. Each time she pointed out such movement, Catherine would glance casually in the indicated direction and nod without apparent concern. "Friends of yours?" Elizabeth asked after the third such sighting. "Security," Catherine replied. "My employer takes the safety of his guests quite seriously." Guests, another euphemism, though Elizabeth was beginning to appreciate the careful language. She wasn't exactly a prisoner, but she certainly wasn't free to leave unescorted. The distinction mattered less than she'd expected. She had nowhere else to go, and no resources to get there. By late afternoon, they were climbing through a narrow defile between towering cliff faces that blocked out most of the sky. The trail was barely wide enough for single-file travel, with sheer drops on one side and smooth rock walls on the other. It was the perfect country for an ambush, though Catherine's relaxed posture suggested no such danger existed. The defile opened suddenly into a hidden valley, perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide. Elizabeth's first impression was of an oasis: green grass, flowing water, and scattered groves of cottonwoods, creating an island of fertility in the surrounding wasteland. Her second impression was of deliberate organization that spoke of permanent settlement, a collection of substantial buildings clustered around a natural amphitheater near the valley's center. Unlike the crude structures she'd seen in frontier settlements, these were built with obvious care and attention to both function and appearance. Stone foundations supported walls of dressed timber, while roof lines showed the clean lines of skilled craftsmanship. People moved among the buildings with purposeful efficiency, men and women engaged in various tasks that suggested a self-sufficient community. Elizabeth counted at least 40 adults, possibly more, along with a handful of children whose presence indicated this was more than a temporary gathering. "Welcome to Sanctuary Valley," Catherine said, pride evident in her voice. Population 137, including 23 children and 16 women. We have our own blacksmith, doctor, and schoolteacher, though the latter has been somewhat overwhelmed by recent growth. Elizabeth stared at the scene below them, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with her preconceptions about outlaw camps. This looked more like a prosperous farming community than a criminal hideout, complete with vegetable gardens, livestock pens, and what appeared to be a small church. How long has this existed? 6 years. Though significant expansion occurred only recently, my employer has been quite successful in attracting settlers who value security over strict legal niceties. Catherine pointed to a large building near the valley's center. "That's where you'll be staying, comfortable quarters with all necessary amenities." As they descended toward the settlement, Elizabeth found herself the object of considerable attention. People paused in their work to watch the newcomers, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. Children pointed and whispered, until adults hushed them with gentle authority. The large building Catherine had indicated proved to be a combination community center and boarding house, with a wide veranda that offered shade during the day and gathering space in the evenings. Several people waited on the veranda, their posture suggesting they'd been expecting this arrival. Catherine dismounted and moved immediately to a man who'd been sitting in a large wooden chair positioned to command a view of the valley's entrance. Elizabeth's first impression was of size. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his carefully tailored shirt. Her second impression was of unexpected refinement in his features and bearing. This was obviously the man who ruled Sanctuary Valley, though he bore little resemblance to Elizabeth's mental image of an outlaw leader. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, his clothes well-made and properly fitted. He stood as Catherine approached, his movements suggesting physical power held under careful control. "Mrs. Harper," Catherine announced formally, "allow me to present Thomas Mitchell, founder and leader of our community." Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture that belonged in drawing rooms rather than outlaw camps. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated accent of the eastern seaboard, overlaid with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Harper, welcome to Sanctuary Valley. I trust your journey was comfortable despite its length." Elizabeth found herself looking up into intelligent green eyes that studied her with frank appraisal. Everything about Thomas Mitchell contradicted her expectations: his courtesy, his obvious education, his genuine concern for her comfort. Yet the deference shown to him by everyone in sight left no doubt about his authority or the nature of that authority. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, accepting his offered handshake, "Mrs. Reeves has explained something of what you're seeking, though I confess many details remain unclear." His smile was both charming and somehow dangerous. "I imagine they do. Catherine tends toward discretion in such matters, which serves us well but can be frustrating for those seeking clarity." He gestured toward the building behind him. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation over dinner? I'm quite eager to discuss your educational background and what you might be willing to teach a somewhat unconventional student." As Elizabeth was escorted toward what she now realized would be her new home for the foreseeable future, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 3 days. She'd gone from disgraced schoolteacher to protected resident of an outlaw settlement, from impending poverty to generous employment, with a man who commanded loyalty through methods she could only guess at. Tomorrow, she would begin the most unusual teaching assignment of her career, attempting to provide sophisticated education to someone who'd built his power through decidedly unsophisticated means. The intellectual challenge was fascinating, the personal danger considerable, and the moral implications completely unclear. But for the first time in years, Elizabeth Harper felt like she might actually matter to someone, even if that someone operated outside every law she'd been taught to respect. Elizabeth's first formal lesson with Thomas Mitchell began at dawn, in a room that defied every expectation she'd formed about outlaw hideouts. The space occupied the entire second floor of what the residents called the main house, with tall windows that captured the morning light and shelves lined with more books than she'd seen outside of university libraries. Her student sat behind a mahogany desk that belonged in a Boston law office, not a remote valley in untamed Colorado territory. He'd exchanged his outdoor clothes for a white shirt and dark vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders while lending him an air of scholarly respectability. Only the Colt revolver hanging from a peg near the door suggested this wasn't an ordinary tutorial session. "I should probably begin by explaining exactly what I hope to accomplish," Thomas said, setting down a leather portfolio thick with papers, "and what I need you to understand about the situation we're all facing." Elizabeth opened her own materials, texts on rhetoric, grammar, literature, and correspondence that she'd salvaged from her teaching career. Mrs. Reeves mentioned something about federal attention and the need for refinement in dealing with authorities. That's diplomatically phrased. Thomas's smile carried genuine amusement. "The truth is somewhat more complex and considerably more dangerous." He stood and moved to a large map mounted on the far wall, its surface marked with pins, colored thread, and notations in several different hands. Elizabeth recognized the general geography of Colorado territory, but the detailed annotations suggested information far beyond what any civilian should possess. Federal Marshal Samuel Crawford arrived in Denver 3 weeks ago with a mandate to investigate what Washington calls organized criminal enterprise in the Southern Territories, Thomas began, pointing to several red pins clustered around major settlements. "He's brought 6 deputies, considerable funding, and authorization to coordinate with military authorities if necessary." Elizabeth studied the map, noting patterns in the markings that suggested extensive surveillance networks. You seem remarkably well informed about federal operations. Information is survival out here, Mrs. Harper. We maintain contacts in places that matter. Telegraph offices, hotels where lawmen stay, saloons where they drink when they think no one's listening. Thomas traced a line between several pins. Crawford's investigation has already identified what he believes are key figures in illegal activities. My name features prominently on his list. And you think education will help you avoid arrest? Thomas returned to his desk, retrieving a newspaper from the portfolio. Read this, please, from last week's Denver Post. Elizabeth accepted the paper, noting it was folded to highlight a specific article. Territorial Governor announces Commission on Frontier Development. The piece described plans for a formal territorial council that would address issues of settlement, commerce and law enforcement in remote regions. I don't understand the significance, she admitted after reading. Governor Harrison is a practical man facing an impossible situation, Thomas explained. He has federal pressure to impose law and order on territory he can't effectively govern, local pressure to protect existing communities, and economic pressure to encourage development that creates tax revenue. He leaned forward, his intensity unmistakable. What he needs is a way to legitimize existing power structures while maintaining federal authority. The implications began crystallizing in Elizabeth's mind. You want to become legitimate, transform from outlaw leader to territorial authority. Exactly, but that transformation requires more than just changing titles or writing new laws. It requires demonstrating that we're capable of civilized governance, not just effective force. Thomas gestured toward the bookshelves. It requires speaking the language of educated men, understanding legal principles, presenting arguments that politicians can support without appearing to endorse criminality. Elizabeth set down the newspaper, finally understanding the scope of what he was asking. You want me to teach you to sound like someone who belongs in government chambers rather than wanted posters? Among other things, yes, but there's more. Thomas opened another section of his portfolio, revealing correspondence written in several different hands. We govern a community of nearly 150 people, Mrs. Harper. We resolve disputes, organize defense, manage resources, maintain order. We do everything a legitimate government does, but without the framework that makes such authority officially recognized. Elizabeth examined the papers, reports on crop yields, schedules for guard rotations, inventories of weapons and supplies, records of judicial decisions. The documentation revealed a sophisticated operation that bore little resemblance to popular notions of outlaw gangs. How long have you been doing this? 6 years actively, though the foundation took longer to establish. Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. I came west after the war with nothing but military experience and a profound distrust of federal authority. Found others with similar backgrounds and similar grievances. We started by providing protection services to settlers who couldn't rely on official law enforcement. Protection from what? Indians, mostly, though not in the way you might think. The real problems came from corrupt Indian agents who sold government supplies meant for reservations, creating desperation that led to raiding. We dealt with the agents, established direct relationships with tribal leaders, negotiated agreements that federal authorities couldn't or wouldn't arrange. Elizabeth absorbed this information, recognizing it as another piece in Thomas's careful justification of his activities. And the federal government considers this interference with Indian affairs. The federal government considers anything that reduces their control to be criminal interference, regardless of effectiveness or necessity. Thomas's voice carried an edge of bitterness. But you're beginning to understand the situation. We provide services that federal authority can't provide, but we do so through methods that federal law can't recognize. Hence the need for legitimacy. Hence the need for someone who can help us navigate the transition from necessary outlaws to recognized authorities. Thomas studied her face. The question is whether you're willing to participate in such a transformation. Elizabeth considered the proposal, weighing intellectual fascination against moral uncertainty. What exactly would my role involve? Initially, refining my ability to communicate with educated officials without betraying my background. Learning the proper forms for legal documents, official correspondence, diplomatic negotiations. Thomas enumerated items as if reading from a mental list. Later, possibly helping establish formal educational institutions for our community, creating documentation that supports our claim to legitimate governance. And if federal marshals arrive before this transformation is complete, Thomas's smile turned cold. Then we defend ourselves using methods that don't require formal education. The threat was delivered calmly, but Elizabeth recognized steel beneath the civilized veneer. Thomas Mitchell might aspire to legitimacy, but he'd built his power through violence and remained prepared to use it. The reminder was both reassuring and troubling. I need to understand something, Elizabeth said carefully. Mrs. Reeves mentioned that you rescued me from people collecting my husband's debts. How did you even know about my situation? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing how much to reveal. We monitor threats to people whose skills we value. Your educational background made you a person of interest even before circumstances in Cedar Falls deteriorated. You've been watching me. We've been aware of you. There's a difference, though perhaps not one that provides much comfort. Thomas opened a different folder, revealing what appeared to be detailed reports. Your husband's gambling debts were acquired by Marcus Donovan, who operates several enterprises in Denver and Salt Lake City. His collection methods are comprehensive. Elizabeth felt ice forming in her stomach. What kind of enterprises? Officially, freight hauling and hotel management. Unofficially, anything that generates profit without excessive government oversight. Thomas's expression grew serious. Including human trafficking, particularly women with desirable skills or appearance. Your education and refinement would have commanded premium prices in certain markets. The casual mention of her potential, fate as merchandise, sent a shudder through Elizabeth. How did you learn about Donovan's interest in me? One of his agents approached our contacts in Salt Lake City, seeking information about educated women in remote settlements. Your name came up, along with details about your circumstances and location. Thomas closed the folder with deliberate care. We decided intervention was warranted. Why? What possible interest could my situation hold for you? Thomas stood and moved to the windows, looking out over Sanctuary Valley, where people were beginning their daily routines. Because waste offends me, Mrs. Harper. The idea that someone with your abilities would be reduced to merchandise for Donovan's clients represents exactly the kind of waste that federal incompetence creates. So you rescued me for philosophical reasons? I rescued you because talent is precious and should be protected. Thomas turned back to face her. But I'm offering you employment because I believe you can help us achieve something significant. Elizabeth studied his face, trying to read motivations behind carefully controlled expressions. And if I refuse? If I decide I want to leave Sanctuary Valley? Then Catherine will escort you safely to whatever destination you choose, with sufficient funds to establish yourself comfortably. Thomas's tone was matter of fact. Though I should mention that Donovan's interest in you hasn't diminished. Changing locations won't necessarily resolve that particular problem. The implication was clear. She could leave, but she'd be trading the protection of Thomas's organization for continued vulnerability to people who viewed her as valuable property. It wasn't exactly coercion, but it certainly limited her practical options. What happened to the previous teacher you mentioned, the one who was overwhelmed by recent growth? Marcus Reynolds? He's still here, focusing on the children's education, while I handle adult instruction needs. Thomas returned to his desk. You'll meet him later today. Good man, though his background is more practical than academic. Elizabeth sensed there was more to that story, but decided not to press for details. Very well, Mr. Mitchell. I accept your proposal, though I reserve the right to reconsider if circumstances change. Naturally. Now, shall we begin with some practical matters? Thomas opened a thick book that Elizabeth recognized as Blackstone's Commentaries on English Law. I need to understand the legal principles that govern territorial incorporation, particularly the process by which unofficial governance structures can achieve official recognition. For the next 3 hours, Elizabeth found herself engaged in the most intellectually stimulating conversation she'd had in years. Thomas proved to be a remarkably quick student with an instinctive grasp of complex concepts. His questions revealed not just intelligence, but strategic thinking that impressed her despite her reservations about his methods. He'd clearly read extensively on subjects ranging from political philosophy to economic theory, though his education had been largely self-directed and showed gaps that formal schooling would have filled. Elizabeth found herself genuinely excited by the challenge of helping him refine raw intelligence into sophisticated understanding. Your military background shows in how you approach problems, she observed, as they discussed territorial governance structures. You think in terms of objectives, resources, and obstacles rather than abstract principles. Is that problematic? For educational purposes? Actually, it's quite helpful. Many students struggle to connect theoretical knowledge with practical application. You instinctively seek useful applications for everything you learn. Elizabeth made notes in her teaching journal, though we'll need to work on presenting arguments in ways that appeal to people with different intellectual approaches, such as politicians respond to precedent and procedure. Judges want to see legal principles properly applied. Business leaders focus on practical outcomes and cost-benefit analysis. Elizabeth enumerated different audiences as she wrote. Each requires a different rhetorical approach, even when discussing identical information. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Like choosing different weapons for different tactical situations. Exactly, though perhaps we should avoid military metaphors when dealing with civilian authorities. Their lesson was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Catherine entered without waiting for permission, her expression suggesting urgent business. Thomas, we have a situation developing. Riders approaching from the north, at least 8 men, possibly more. They're not using the standard approach routes. Thomas was on his feet immediately, the scholar disappearing as the military commander emerged. Recognition? None yet, but their formation suggests federal authority, professional spacing, disciplined movement. Catherine glanced at Elizabeth. They'll reach the valley entrance within the hour. Elizabeth watched the transformation in her, Thomas, with fascination and growing unease. The refined gentleman who'd been discussing legal theory moments before now moved with predatory alertness. His entire bearing shifted to meet potential threats. Mrs. Harper, I'm afraid we'll need to postpone our lesson, Thomas said, already moving toward his gun belt. Catherine, see that Mrs. Harper is secured in the safe room until we determine these visitors' intentions. Safe room? Elizabeth stood, as well, alarm growing. A precaution we've found necessary, Thomas explained, checking his revolver's cylinder with practiced efficiency. Until we know whether these riders represent negotiation or confrontation, you'll be more secure in protected quarters. Catherine moved to Elizabeth's side with gentle but unmistakable authority. This way, Mrs. Harper. It's quite comfortable, and hopefully we won't need it for long. As Elizabeth was escorted from the study, she caught a glimpse of Thomas issuing rapid orders to men who'd appeared at the door. The civilized scholar had completely vanished, replaced by someone whose casual competence with violence reminded her exactly what kind of man she was, now depending upon for protection. The safe room proved to be a windowless chamber in the building's basement, furnished with books, lamps, and basic comforts, but clearly designed for extended occupation under siege conditions. As Catherine secured the heavy door, Elizabeth realized she was about to discover whether Thomas Mitchell's aspirations toward legitimacy would survive contact with federal authority. Through the thick walls, she could hear the distant sounds of preparation, running footsteps, shouted orders, the metallic sounds of weapons being readied. Sanctuary Valley was transforming from peaceful community to armed camp, revealing the military organization that underlay its civilian appearance. Elizabeth sat in the lamplight and wondered whether her first day as Thomas Mitchell's tutor would also be her last. Elizabeth spent 4 hours in the safe room, listening to the sounds of Sanctuary Valley transforming into a fortress. Footsteps echoed overhead in patterns that suggested coordinated movement. Not the chaos of panic, but the disciplined preparation of people who drilled for exactly this scenario. Through the thick walls, she could hear the distant sounds of children being moved to secure locations, livestock being herded into protective enclosures, and the metallic clicks of weapons being loaded and checked. When Catherine finally opened the heavy door, her expression was grim but not defeated. "They're gone, but we need to talk immediately. Thomas wants to see you in his office." What happened? Were they federal marshals? Worse. Catherine's voice carried an edge Elizabeth hadn't heard before. "They were Marcus Donovan's men, the ones who were hunting you. Somehow they tracked you here." Elizabeth felt her blood turn to ice. The human traffickers who'd been pursuing her had found Sanctuary Valley, potentially bringing federal attention to Thomas's operation. She'd brought danger to the very people who'd protected her from it. How is that possible? We took precautions, changed routes. That's what we need to determine. Catherine's expression was unreadable as they climbed the stairs toward the main floor. Thomas has some theories, but they're not pleasant ones. The community Elizabeth emerged into bore little resemblance to the peaceful settlement she'd left that morning. Armed men occupied strategic positions throughout the buildings, their weapons visible and ready. Women moved with quiet efficiency, securing supplies and preparing for potential siege. Children had vanished entirely, presumably moved to whatever secure locations the community maintained for emergencies. Thomas's office had been transformed into a command center. Maps covered every surface, marked with defensive positions and escape routes. Several men Elizabeth hadn't met before stood around the central table, their bearings suggesting military backgrounds similar to Thomas's own. The genteel scholar she'd been tutoring was nowhere to be seen. In his place stood a war leader preparing for battle. "Mrs. Harper," Thomas said without looking up from the map he was studying. "I need you to think very carefully about everything that happened during your departure from Cedar Falls. Every person you spoke with, every detail Mrs. Reeves shared with you, every stop we made during the journey here." Elizabeth approached the table, noting the tension in every face around it. "What exactly are you looking for?" How Donovan's men knew where to find you. Thomas finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something cold and calculating that made her stomach clench. 8 riders don't just happen to discover a hidden valley that's remained secret for 6 years. They were guided here. You think someone betrayed our location? I think someone provided very specific information about our routes, our timing, and our destination. Thomas pointed to several marks on the map. They knew exactly which trails we'd used, exactly when we'd arrive, exactly where to position themselves for optimal surveillance. That level of detail suggests inside knowledge. Elizabeth studied the faces around the table, realizing that she was now under suspicion. You think I somehow led them here? I think you're the only new variable in an equation that's remained stable for years, Thomas replied evenly. Which means either you're working with Donovan, or someone used you to track us without your knowledge. The accusation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. After everything she'd been through, after accepting protection from people who operated outside the law, she was now being accused of betraying them to the very criminals they'd saved her from. That's impossible. I had no contact with anyone. After leaving Cedar Falls, except the people in this room, then explain how 8 professional trackers found a location that federal marshals have been searching for unsuccessfully for 3 years. Thomas's voice remained calm, but Elizabeth could see the anger beneath his controlled exterior. Explain how they knew to position themselves at exactly the right vantage points to observe our defensive preparations. Elizabeth felt panic rising in her chest. Everything she'd built here, the intellectual stimulation, the sense of purpose, the protection from threats she'd never fully understood, was crumbling around a suspicion she couldn't prove false. There has to be another explanation. Maybe they followed Catherine's group when they came to Cedar Falls. Maybe they've been watching the area for weeks. Catherine's group was clean. We verified that before they ever reached Cedar Falls. Thomas moved to a different map, this one showing the approaches to Sanctuary Valley. These men knew things that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of our operations. One of the men Elizabeth didn't recognize, a grizzled individual with a livid scar across his left cheek, spoke up. Could be she's telling the truth about not knowing, but still carrying information somehow. These city folks are careless with letters, documents, personal effects. Thomas nodded slowly. Mrs. Harper, I need to examine everything you brought with you. Every letter, every document, every personal item. Something you're carrying contains information that led Donovan's men directly to us. Elizabeth felt her privacy dissolving, but recognized she had little choice in the matter. Of course, though I can't imagine what could possibly contain such information. 20 minutes later, the contents of Elizabeth's trunks and carpet bags were spread across Thomas's desk like evidence in a criminal investigation. Her books, clothes, personal letters, teaching materials, and few pieces of jewelry lay exposed to the scrutiny of men whose survival might depend on discovering hidden threats. Thomas handled each item with methodical care, examining bindings, checking seams, looking for anything that might conceal tracking devices or coded messages. Elizabeth watched with growing humiliation as strangers poured through her most personal possessions, discussing her poverty-stricken circumstances and tragic history with clinical detachment. Wait, Catherine said suddenly, holding up a small, leather journal Elizabeth had forgotten she possessed. When did you last write in this? Elizabeth examined the journal, a gift from her sister years ago that she'd used sporadically for personal reflections. I'm not sure. Months ago, perhaps. Longer, why? Catherine opened the journal to its final entries, scanning Elizabeth's handwriting with growing alarm. Thomas, look at this. Entry dated 2 weeks ago, describing her teaching routine in Cedar Falls. Daily schedule, usual routes through town, even mentions where she takes her evening walks. Thomas took the journal, reading the entries with increasing tension. This isn't Mrs. Harper's handwriting. Someone else has been using this journal to document her movements and habits. Elizabeth stared at the unfamiliar writing, feeling the world tilt around her. That's impossible. I've had that journal with me constantly. Have you? Thomas's question was sharp. Think carefully, Mrs. Harper. Has this journal ever been out of your possession, even briefly? Elizabeth tried to remember, panic making her thoughts scatter. At the boarding house, Mrs. Brennan cleaned my room weekly. She might have had access to my belongings during those times. Mrs. Brennan. Catherine's voice was thoughtful. The woman who conveniently had a nephew who needed your room just as you were being forced to leave town. The implications crystallized. With terrifying clarity, Mrs. Brennan had been positioned to monitor Elizabeth's activities, documenting her routines and movements for someone who planned to use that information. The convenient timing of her eviction had been part of a larger plan to flush Elizabeth from hiding and track her to whoever offered protection. Donovan's been planning this for months, Thomas concluded grimly. He didn't just want to collect you. He wanted to identify and eliminate the people who might interfere with his operations. Elizabeth sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the realization that she'd been unwittingly used as bait in a trap designed to destroy the very people who'd saved her. "I'm so sorry. I never suspected—" "No reason you should have," Thomas said, his anger now clearly directed elsewhere. "Donovan's people are professionals. They know how to manipulate situations without their targets realizing what's happening." The scarred man spoke up again. "Question is, what do we do about it now? Donovan's men know our location, our defenses, our numbers. They'll be back with reinforcements and probably federal backup." Thomas returned to the map table, his expression grim. "How many men can Donovan field?" 20, maybe 30, if he pulls resources from his other operations," Catherine replied. "But if he's coordinating with federal authorities, that number could double or triple." Elizabeth watched the strategic discussion with growing horror. She'd brought destruction to the only place that had offered her safety and purpose. The community that had welcomed her was now facing annihilation because of her presence. "There is another option," she said quietly, interrupting the military. "You're planning." "I could leave, draw them away from Sanctuary Valley." Thomas looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Noble sentiment, Mrs. Harper, but tactically unsound. Donovan's men have already identified this location. Removing you won't eliminate the threat we now face." "Then what will?" "Eliminating the threat at its source." Thomas's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd made similar decisions before. "Donovan operates out of Denver, but he has supply lines and communication networks that extend throughout the territory. If we can disrupt those networks, we can buy time to relocate or negotiate." Elizabeth felt herself being drawn into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. "You're talking about war." "I'm talking about survival," Thomas corrected. "Donovan has made this personal by threatening our community. The only way to resolve such threats is to make the cost of aggression too high to sustain." One of the other men, a younger individual with intelligent eyes, spoke up. "We could try negotiation first. Offer to trade something Donovan values more than his grudge against Mrs. Harper, such as information. We know things about his operations that federal authorities would find very interesting. Evidence of corruption, bribery, connections to officials who should be above suspicion." Thomas considered this suggestion with obvious interest. That might work, but it would require someone with the skills to negotiate at that level. Someone who understands the legal implications and can present our position professionally. Elizabeth realized they were looking at her. "You want me to negotiate with the man who planned to sell me into slavery? I want you to help us craft a proposal that protects this community while offering Donovan a face-saving exit from a situation that's escalated beyond his original intentions," Thomas replied. "Your educational background gives you credibility that none of us possess. Your personal investment in the outcome ensures you'll argue our position effectively." The proposal was both terrifying and intriguing. Elizabeth had never imagined herself negotiating with criminals, but the intellectual challenge was undeniable. More importantly, it offered a chance to actively contribute to the protection of people who'd risked everything to save her. What exactly would such a negotiation involve? demonstrating that continued aggression against Sanctuary Valley would be more costly than beneficial, Thomas explained. Showing Donovan that we possess information and resources that make us dangerous, enemies but potentially valuable allies. Catherine spread out a different set of documents on the table: financial records, correspondence, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. We've been documenting Donovan's operations for 2 years, originally as defensive intelligence. But some of what we've discovered could seriously damage his business interests if it reached the right people. Elizabeth examined the documents, her teacher's eye quickly identifying patterns and connections. These show systematic corruption of federal officials, don't they? Payments to territorial judges, bribes to military procurement officers, kickbacks to Indian agents, among other things, Thomas confirmed. The question is whether we can present this information in a way that gives Donovan incentive to withdraw rather than escalate. Elizabeth studied the evidence with growing fascination. The documentation was extensive and appeared thoroughly researched, suggesting an intelligence operation far more sophisticated than she'd expected from an outlaw organization. How did you gather all this information? Carefully and over considerable time, Thomas replied. We maintain contacts throughout the territory, people who owe us favors, people who share our distrust of federal authority, people who simply believe in fair dealing. Information flows to those who know how to collect and evaluate it. Elizabeth began to understand that Thomas's operation was far more than a simple outlaw gang. It was a shadow government with its own intelligence services, diplomatic networks, and strategic objectives. The realization was both impressive and deeply unsettling. If I agree to help with this negotiation, what exactly would be my role? Draft the proposal, help present it in language that appeals to Donovan's self-interest, serve as a witness to any agreements reached. Thomas's expression was serious. But understand the risks, Mrs. Harper. If negotiation fails, you'll be in greater danger than before. Donovan will view your participation as active opposition rather than passive victimhood. Elizabeth considered the proposition, weighing her limited options against the potential consequences. She could refuse and remain under protection while others fought battles on her behalf, or she could actively participate in securing her own freedom and the safety of people who'd become important to her. When would this negotiation take place? Within the week, assuming Donovan accepts our invitation to discuss terms. Thomas began gathering the documents. We'll need to work quickly to prepare our position and anticipate his responses. Elizabeth nodded slowly, realizing she was crossing another line in her transformation from respectable teacher to active participant in activities that existed far outside legal boundaries. I'll need to understand more about Donovan's operations and motivations before I can help craft an effective proposal. Catherine will brief you on everything we know about his business interests and personal psychology, Thomas replied. But Mrs. Harper, I need you to understand something clearly. Once you participate in this negotiation, there's no going back. To your previous life, you'll be permanently associated with our organization in the eyes of federal authorities. The warning was clear. Agreeing to help would complete her transformation from victim to active participant in Thomas's war against federal authority and criminal competition. She would be crossing the line from protected refugee to full member of an outlaw organization. Elizabeth looked around the room at the faces of people who'd risked their lives to save her from a fate she'd never fully understood. She thought about the community she'd seen, the children being educated, the families building lives in a place where they could defend themselves against threats that federal law couldn't address. I understand the implications, she said finally, and I accept them. When do we begin? Thomas's smile was the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him since the crisis began. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Harper. We have a war to prevent and a community to protect. Your real education in frontier justice is about to begin." As Elizabeth prepared for what might be the most dangerous assignment of her life, she reflected on how completely her circumstances had changed. 3 days ago, she'd been a disgraced teacher fleeing scandal. Now she was preparing to negotiate with human traffickers on behalf of an outlaw organization that had become her only hope for survival and purpose. The irony wasn't lost on her, that the most meaningful work of her career might involve legitimizing the very people that law and order were designed to suppress. But in a territory where federal authority existed mostly on paper, perhaps legitimacy was simply another word for effectiveness. Tomorrow would determine whether Thomas Mitchell's vision of transforming from outlaw to legitimate leader could survive contact with the harsh realities of territorial politics. Elizabeth's role in that transformation would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone in Sanctuary Valley who depended on Thomas's protection. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option any of them could afford to consider. The War Council convened at midnight in the basement of the main house, in a room Elizabeth hadn't known existed until Catherine led her down a concealed staircase behind what appeared to be a storage closet. The underground chamber was larger than Thomas's office above, with stone walls that would muffle sound and multiple exits that suggested it had been designed for exactly this kind of clandestine meeting. 12 people sat around a rough wooden table lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Elizabeth recognized Thomas and Catherine, but the others were strangers whose presence suggested the full scope of Thomas's network was finally being revealed. These weren't just the residents of Sanctuary Valley. They were representatives of something much larger and more organized. "Before we begin," Thomas announced, "I want everyone to understand that Mrs. Harper has agreed to participate in our negotiations with Donovan. Her expertise will be crucial to crafting a proposal that achieves our objectives without triggering federal intervention." A woman Elizabeth hadn't met before, perhaps 50 years old with silver hair and intelligent eyes, spoke from across the table. "Is it wise to involve a civilian in operations of this nature, especially one whose presence created the current crisis?" Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Thomas responded before she could defend herself. "Mrs. Harper's involvement wasn't voluntary, Martha. She was manipulated by professionals who used her as an unwitting tool. Now she's offering to help resolve the situation she was forced to create. The question," added a man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw, "is whether we can trust someone who's been compromised once to remain secure during sensitive negotiations." Elizabeth had endured enough suspicion and doubt. She stood, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns about my reliability. You're right to question whether someone who was successfully manipulated once can be trusted with crucial information. But let me offer you a different perspective." The room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Elizabeth drew on every technique she'd learned in years of managing hostile school boards and skeptical parents. "I've spent the past week learning about Mr. Mitchell's organization, and I'm impressed by its sophistication and effectiveness. You've built something remarkable here, a functioning government that provides services federal authority can't or won't provide. But you're facing a fundamental problem that force alone cannot solve." She moved around the table, making eye contact with each person as she continued. "Marcus Donovan represents more than just a personal threat to me or even to Sanctuary Valley. He's part of a larger network of criminal enterprises that profit from the federal government's inability to maintain order in remote territories. Defeating him through violence might eliminate one threat, but it would also prove to federal authorities that you're exactly the kind of dangerous criminals they believe you to be." Thomas leaned forward, clearly interested in her analysis. Continue. What you need is legitimacy, official recognition that transforms you from outlaws to territorial authorities. That legitimacy can only come through negotiation and political maneuvering, not through military victory. Elizabeth returned to her seat, confident now that she had their attention. I may have been compromised once, but that experience has given me unique insight into how your enemies think and operate. Use that knowledge to your advantage. Martha, the older woman, studied Elizabeth with new interest. What exactly are you proposing? A comprehensive strategy that goes beyond simply neutralizing Donovan's immediate threat. We need to address the underlying political and economic factors that make men like him powerful in the first place. Elizabeth opened the leather portfolio she'd brought with her, revealing notes she'd spent hours preparing. I've analyzed the documentation you've gathered about territorial politics, and I believe there's an opportunity to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. She spread several pages across the table, her handwriting neat, despite the urgency of their preparation. Governor Harrison faces enormous pressure from Washington to demonstrate effective governance in remote territories. At the same time, he's struggling with limited resources and hostile local populations who distrust federal authority. Thomas picked up one of the pages, scanning Elizabeth's analysis. You're suggesting we offer to help solve his political problems? I'm suggesting we position ourselves as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Elizabeth pointed to specific sections of her notes. Your organization already provides many governmental services: law enforcement, dispute resolution, resource management, defense against hostile elements. The challenge is presenting these activities as beneficial rather than criminal. The scarred man, who'd been introduced as William Patterson, shook his head skeptically. Federal authorities don't negotiate with outlaws. They arrest them or kill them. Federal authorities negotiate with anyone who can help them achieve their objectives, Elizabeth countered. The key is demonstrating that cooperation serves their interests better than confrontation. Catherine spread out a map of Colorado territory, marked with various settlements and territorial boundaries. What specific arrangement are you envisioning? Elizabeth studied the map, noting patterns she'd observed in the documentation Thomas had shared. A three-part proposal. First, we offer to provide evidence against Marcus Donovan that will allow federal authorities to eliminate a significant criminal enterprise. Second, we propose formal recognition of Sanctuary Valley as a territorial municipality, with Mr. Mitchell as its appointed administrator. Third, we establish a precedent for similar arrangements in other remote areas where federal authority is ineffective. The room erupted in discussion as the implications of Elizabeth's proposal sank in. Some voices expressed skepticism about federal willingness to negotiate. Others worried about the risks of revealing their capabilities, and a few questioned whether legitimacy was worth the constraints it would impose. Thomas raised his hand for silence. The proposal has merit, but it requires careful coordination with people who understand territorial politics better than we do. Martha, what's your assessment of Governor Harrison's current position? Martha consulted a small notebook filled with cramped handwriting. Desperate would be accurate. He's facing congressional hearings about territorial management next month, and he has very little success to report. 3 major settlements have been abandoned due to Indian raids, commerce is disrupted by bandit activity, and tax collection is virtually non-existent in most remote areas. And Marshal Crawford's investigation? Proceeding slowly but methodically. He's identified several targets, but hasn't yet accumulated sufficient evidence for prosecutions. However, he's requested additional resources and federal troops to support enforcement operations. Martha's expression was grim. If those resources are approved, this territory will see military occupation within 6 months. The threat of military occupation hung over the room like a storm cloud. Elizabeth could see in their faces that everyone understood the implications. Federal troops would mean the end of any hope for negotiated legitimacy and the beginning of a guerrilla war that few of them would survive. "How much time do we have?" Thomas asked. "Crawford's next report to Washington is due in 2 weeks," Martha replied. "If he can show significant progress by then, his request for additional resources will likely be approved. If not, he'll be recalled and replaced with someone more aggressive." Elizabeth saw opportunity in the timeline. 2 weeks gives us a narrow window to present our proposal and demonstrate its effectiveness. We need to move quickly but carefully. Thomas turned to another council member, a younger man with the weather-beaten appearance of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. "Jacob, what's the status of our contacts in Denver?" "Still reliable, though they're nervous about increased federal attention. Judge Morrison is particularly concerned about his association with our information network." Jacob consulted his own notes. However, he's indicated willingness to facilitate informal discussions if we can guarantee his involvement remains confidential. Elizabeth felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align. Judge Morrison could serve as an intermediary between us and Governor Harrison, someone with legal credentials who can present our proposal as a legitimate political initiative rather than criminal negotiation. "Assuming Morrison agrees to such involvement," Catherine cautioned, "he's risked enough already by providing us with legal intelligence. The risk might be worth it if we can offer him something valuable in return," Elizabeth suggested. "What does Judge Morrison need that we can provide?" Thomas exchanged glances with several council members before answering. "Morrison has been investigating territorial judicial corruption for years, but he lacks the evidence necessary to expose the network. Some of our intelligence about Donovan's operations includes documentation of bribes to territorial judges." Elizabeth's pulse quickened as she recognized the potential for a complex exchange of favors. "So we offer Morrison the evidence he needs to clean up territorial courts. Morrison facilitates our negotiations with Governor Harrison, and Harrison gets a solution to his territorial management problems. While we eliminate Donovan's threat and achieve legitimate recognition," Thomas concluded. "It's elegant, but it requires perfect coordination and assumes everyone involved will honor their commitments." Martha leaned back in her chair, studying Elizabeth with obvious reassessment. "You've given this considerable thought, Mrs. Harper, but you're proposing to trust our survival to political promises from people who have no reason to honor agreements with outlaws." "I'm proposing to give them reasons to honor those agreements," Elizabeth replied. "People keep promises when breaking them costs more than keeping them. We need to structure any arrangement so that betraying us damages their own interests." William Patterson spoke up again. "What guarantees do we have that federal authorities won't simply arrest us all once they have the evidence against Donovan?" Elizabeth had anticipated this question and spent considerable time developing her answer. "We maintain leverage through controlled revelation of information. Evidence against Donovan is provided in stages, tied to specific performance benchmarks. In our legitimization process, if federal authorities betray the agreement, they lose access to evidence they need for prosecution." The discussion continued for another 2 hours as the council examined every aspect of Elizabeth's proposal, identifying potential problems and developing contingency plans. By the time they adjourned, Elizabeth felt as though she'd been through an intensive course in territorial politics and criminal strategy. As the others departed through various exits, Thomas remained behind with Elizabeth and Catherine. The underground chamber felt even more secretive, with only 3 people, shadows, dancing more wildly in the reduced light. "You impressed them," Thomas said simply. Martha hasn't been convinced by anyone's proposals in the 5 years I've known her." Elizabeth felt a flush of pride despite her exhaustion. "I hope I can deliver on what I've promised. The next 2 weeks will determine whether my theories can survive contact with reality." Catherine consulted a pocket watch. "First step is arranging contact with Judge Morrison. I can reach Denver within 36 hours if we move quickly." "What about Donovan?" Elizabeth asked. "While we're pursuing political solutions, he's undoubtedly planning another attack on Sanctuary Valley." Thomas's expression grew cold. "Donovan's immediate threat will be addressed through more direct methods while you pursue diplomatic channels. We've learned not to depend entirely on negotiation when dealing with men who profit from chaos." Elizabeth understood the implication. Thomas would be preparing for war while she attempted to prevent it through politics. The dual approach made tactical sense, but increased the complexity of an already dangerous situation. If violence breaks out while negotiations are proceeding, it could undermine everything we're trying to achieve, she warned. And if we allow Donovan to attack Sanctuary Valley while we're negotiating, there might be nothing left to legitimize. Thomas replied, "Some risks are unavoidable, Mrs. Harper. The key is managing them intelligently." Catherine interrupted their discussion. "There's another factor we need to consider. Mrs. Harper's participation in these negotiations will make her a target for anyone who wants to disrupt the process. Donovan, federal marshals who prefer military solutions, territorial officials who profit from the current chaos, they all have reasons to eliminate her before she can complete her mission." The reminder sent a chill through Elizabeth. She'd been so focused on the intellectual challenge of crafting political solutions that she'd almost forgotten the personal danger involved. Participating in negotiations between outlaws and territorial authorities would make her a target for multiple factions with conflicting interests. "What protection can you provide while I'm traveling to Denver and conducting negotiations?" she asked. "Catherine will accompany you, along with our most experienced agents," Thomas replied. "But ultimately, your safety will depend on completing the mission quickly and successfully." Elizabeth nodded, accepting the reality that she was committing to a course of action with no guarantee of survival. "When do we leave for Denver?" "Tomorrow night. We'll travel by indirect routes and use safe houses that Donovan's people haven't identified." Catherine began gathering the maps and documents scattered across the table. "You'll need to pack lightly, only essential items and materials you'll need for negotiations." As they prepared to leave the underground chamber, Thomas stopped Elizabeth with a gentle hand on her arm. "Mrs. Harper, I want you to understand what you're risking by agreeing to this mission. If our negotiations succeed, you'll be permanently marked as an associate of our organization. If they fail, you'll likely be dead. There's still time to reconsider." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily, recognizing the genuine concern behind his warning. "Mr. Mitchell, 3 weeks ago I was a failed teacher fleeing a scandal with nowhere to go and no prospects for the future. Today, I'm participating in political negotiations that could reshape territorial governance. Whatever the risks, this is the most meaningful work I've ever done." Thomas's smile was both proud and sad. "Your husband was fortunate to have married such a remarkable woman, Mrs. Harper. I hope he realized what a treasure he possessed." The unexpected personal comment caught Elizabeth off guard, reminding her that beneath Thomas's careful control lay someone capable of genuine emotion and human connection. Daniel had many flaws, but he appreciated intelligence in others. "I think he would have understood my decision to help you." "I hope we live long enough to make that decision worthwhile," Thomas replied. As Elizabeth climbed the concealed staircase back to the main floor of the building, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 1 week. She'd gone from protected refugee to strategic planner for an outlaw organization, from victim of circumstances to active participant in territorial politics. Tomorrow night, she would begin the most dangerous journey of her life, carrying proposals that could transform criminal outlaws into legitimate authorities or trigger a war that would destroy everything Thomas had built. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure would likely mean death for everyone she'd come to care about. But for the first time since Daniel's death, Elizabeth felt like her life had genuine purpose, and her talents were being used for something that mattered. Whatever happened in Denver, she would face it with the confidence that comes from finally knowing who you are and what you're capable of achieving. The transformation from widowed teacher to political negotiator was nearly complete. All that remained was to discover whether her new identity would survive the tests that lay ahead. The following morning brought news that complicated their carefully laid plans. Elizabeth was reviewing territorial law documents in Thomas's study when Catherine burst through the door, her usually composed demeanor cracked by obvious alarm. "We have a problem. Jacob just returned from his scouting mission. Donovan's men aren't just planning another attack on Sanctuary Valley. They're moving against our entire network." Thomas looked up from the correspondence he'd been drafting to potential allies in Denver. "Explain." Catherine unfolded a hand-drawn map marked with recent intelligence. Simultaneous raids planned for tomorrow night. The Morrison Ranch, the Sullivan mining operation, the Freeman trading post, every location where we maintain significant resources or personnel. Elizabeth studied the marked locations, recognizing the strategic implications. Immediately, he's trying to eliminate your support structure before you can mobilize it for negotiations. "Worse than that," Catherine continued, "our source in Donovan's organization reports he's coordinating with federal authorities. Marshal Crawford has agreed to provide backup for the raids in exchange for intelligence about our operations." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Elizabeth watched his expression shift from concern to cold fury as he absorbed the implications of federal betrayal of their planned negotiations. "Crawford's decided military action is preferable to political solutions," Thomas said grimly. "Which means our window for negotiation just closed permanently." Elizabeth felt their carefully constructed strategy crumbling around her. "Not necessarily. If Donovan is coordinating with federal authorities, it means Crawford doesn't have sufficient evidence to act independently. He needs Donovan's intelligence to justify his operations. What difference does that make if they're planning coordinated attacks tomorrow night?" Elizabeth moved to the map, studying the marked locations with growing excitement. "It means we can turn the situation to our advantage. What if, instead of being victims of these raids, we're prepared with evidence that proves Donovan is the criminal and you're the legitimate authority?" Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances. "You're suggesting we allow the raids to proceed?" "I'm suggesting we orchestrate the raids to serve our purposes instead of theirs." Elizabeth's mind was racing through possibilities, her teacher's instinct for complex problem-solving fully engaged. "We document everything. Donovan's men committing crimes while federal marshals provide support. We show Crawford's corruption while demonstrating your organization's commitment to legitimate law enforcement." Catherine looked skeptical. "That would require perfect timing and significant risk to our people at those locations. It would also require bait valuable enough to ensure Donovan commits his full resources to the operation," Thomas added thoughtfully. "Something he couldn't resist, regardless of the risks." Elizabeth felt the pieces of a new strategy aligning in her mind. What if the bait were me? Donovan's original target, reportedly located at one of these sites with minimal protection. The suggestion hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Thomas and Catherine stared at her with expressions of alarm and admiration in equal measure. "Absolutely not," Thomas said flatly. "The risks are enormous. If something goes wrong, you'd be captured or killed." If we don't take this opportunity, your entire organization will be destroyed and everyone in Sanctuary Valley will be dead or imprisoned, Elizabeth countered. Sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to take necessary chances. Catherine began pacing, her strategic mind clearly working through the implications. It could work. We position Mrs. Harper at the Morrison Ranch with apparent light security. When Donovan's men attack, we have overwhelming force hidden nearby to document their crimes and Crawford's complicity. And then we have evidence of federal corruption, proof of our organization's legitimate law enforcement activities, and Donovan's network eliminated as a threat. Elizabeth's voice carried growing confidence. Plus documentation that Governor Harrison can use to justify recognizing our authority rather than supporting Crawford's military approach. Thomas studied the map intently, his military experience evaluating tactical possibilities. The Morrison Ranch has excellent defensive positions and multiple escape routes. If we coordinate properly, we could turn Donovan's trap into our victory. Elizabeth felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge combined with genuine danger. This was what her life had been missing. Work that mattered, risks that served a larger purpose, the opportunity to use her intelligence for something more significant than teaching reluctant children basic arithmetic. There's another advantage, she added. Success would prove to territorial authorities that negotiating with your organization produces better results than military confrontation. It establishes the precedent we need for future political discussions. Catherine stopped pacing, her expression shifting from alarm to calculation. We'd need at least 24 hours to position our people properly and establish documentation protocols. Can we delay the raids? Not without revealing that we have intelligence about Donovan's plans, Thomas replied, but we might be able to influence the timing through other means. Elizabeth was already formulating additional elements of the strategy. What if we make it appear that I've uncovered information about Donovan's criminal activities? Something valuable enough that he'd want to capture me immediately rather than wait for coordinated raids, such as evidence linking him to the territorial judicial corruption Judge Morrison has been investigating, documentation that could destroy his entire political protection network if it reaches the right people. Elizabeth felt pieces clicking into place. We leak information, suggesting I've discovered this evidence and am preparing to share it with federal authorities. Thomas nodded slowly, appreciation growing in his expression. Donovan would have to move immediately to prevent such exposure. He'd abandon the coordinated approach in favor of a direct assault on wherever you're supposedly located, which gives us complete control over the timing and location of the confrontation, Catherine concluded, and ensures that federal complicity in the attack is clearly documented. Elizabeth felt the dangerous thrill of a plan that could either secure their future or destroy them all. How quickly can we implement this strategy? Thomas consulted his pocket watch. If we move immediately, we can have people in position by this evening. The false intelligence about your discoveries can be leaked through channels that will reach Donovan within hours. And if something goes wrong? Catherine asked quietly. Then we fight our way out and revert to the original plan of guerrilla warfare against federal occupation, Thomas replied grimly. But if this works, we achieve everything we've been planning through a single decisive action. Elizabeth looked at the two people who'd become not just her protectors, but her closest allies in the most important work of her life. I'm ready to take this risk if you are. Thomas's smile was both proud and sad. Mrs. Harper, you've become everything I hoped for when I first decided to offer you protection. Your courage and intelligence have given us possibilities I never imagined. Then let's make sure those possibilities become reality. Elizabeth replied, feeling the final pieces of her transformation clicking into place. She was no longer the disgraced teacher who'd fled Cedar Falls in desperation. She was Elizabeth Harper, strategic advisor to an outlaw organization that might soon become the legitimate government of Colorado Territory. The most dangerous night of her life was about to begin, and she'd never felt more alive or more certain of her purpose. The Morrison Ranch sat in a natural bowl surrounded by pine-covered ridges, its buildings arranged with the casual efficiency of a working cattle operation. To any observer, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: a modest homestead operated by a widowed rancher and his small crew. What those observers couldn't see were the 23 armed men positioned throughout the surrounding forest, or the sophisticated documentation equipment hidden in the ranch's outbuildings. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window of the main house, watching shadows lengthen across the valley floor as sunset approached. In 2 hours, if their intelligence was accurate, Marcus Donovan would arrive with enough men to overwhelm what appeared to be minimal defenses. The trap was set, but its success depended on dozens of variables beyond their control. Second thoughts? Judge Morrison asked from behind her. The territorial judge had arrived that morning, ostensibly to review legal documents, but actually to serve as an official witness to whatever transpired during the night. Constantly, Elizabeth admitted, but not about the necessity of what we're doing. Morrison joined her at the window, his weathered face thoughtful. In 30 years on the territorial bench, I've never participated in anything remotely like this. The legal implications alone could end my career. The legal implications of continuing current policies could end territorial governance entirely, Elizabeth replied. Sometimes precedent must be created rather than followed. Morrison nodded slowly. Thomas Mitchell has chosen his advisor well. Your analysis of territorial law and federal authority was remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal legal training. Elizabeth felt a flush of pride despite the circumstances. I've had excellent source material to work with. Your correspondence with territorial officials provided crucial insights into the political dynamics we're navigating. Through the window, they could see Thomas emerging from the barn where he'd been coordinating final preparations with his men. Even at a distance, his bearing radiated the confident authority of someone accustomed to command. The transformation, from gentleman scholar to military leader, still impressed Elizabeth with its completeness. What's your assessment of Mitchell's chances for legitimate recognition? Morrison asked quietly. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. If tonight proceeds according to plan, I believe Governor Harrison will have little choice but to negotiate seriously with Thomas's organization. The alternative, military occupation of territory he can't effectively govern, would be far more costly, politically and economically. And if tonight doesn't proceed according to plan, then we'll likely all be dead or imprisoned, and the question becomes moot. Elizabeth's matter-of-fact tone belied the fear she felt. Some gambles are worth taking regardless of the odds. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Catherine entered carrying a leather satchel that Elizabeth recognized as containing the documentation they'd prepared for federal authorities. Final positions are being established. Thomas wants to review the signal protocols one more time. Elizabeth moved to the kitchen table where maps and timing charts were spread beside plates of untouched dinner. The domestic normalcy of the setting contrasted sharply with the military precision of their preparations. Primary signal is 3 lantern flashes from the ridge position when Donovan's men are committed to the approach, she recited. Secondary signal is a single, sustained blast from the ranch horn when documentation should begin. Emergency withdrawal signal is continuous horn blasts. And if communications break down entirely? We improvise based on circumstances and hope our people are positioned well enough to adapt, Elizabeth replied. Some elements of any plan must be left to chance and individual judgment. Thomas entered through the kitchen door, his expression tense but controlled. Scouts report movement approximately 5 miles north. At least 12 riders, possibly more, following at a distance. Timing appears consistent with our projections. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken despite her mental preparation. Federal backup. Not visible yet, but Crawford would likely position his men to arrive after the initial assault begins, maintains plausible deniability while ensuring he can claim credit for any success. Thomas checked his pocket watch. Estimated arrival in 90 minutes. Morrison stood, straightening his formal coat. I should position myself where I can observe and document everything clearly. My testimony will be crucial if this evidence reaches territorial authorities. The root cellar beneath the barn provides excellent sight lines while offering protection, Catherine suggested. We've prepared observation ports specifically for documentation purposes. As Morrison departed for his hiding place, Elizabeth found herself alone with Thomas and Catherine in the kitchen that would soon become the center of a carefully orchestrated battle. The weight of what they were attempting settled over her like a heavy cloak. Any final adjustments to our strategy? Thomas asked. Elizabeth reviewed their plan one more time, searching for overlooked vulnerabilities or missed opportunities. The key is maintaining control of the narrative. We need clear evidence that Donovan's men initiated violence against what appears to be a legitimate law enforcement operation. What if Donovan suspects the trap? Then he either retreats, in which case we've prevented an attack on our network, or he commits anyway because the political stakes are too high to ignore. Elizabeth moved to the window again, scanning the darkening landscape. Either outcome serves our purposes better than allowing coordinated raids to proceed unopposed. Catherine joined them, her own tension visible despite years of experience. With dangerous operations, I still think we should have positioned you somewhere with better escape routes. If something goes wrong... Mr. Donovan, Crawford called out, his decision apparently made. You and your men will surrender your weapons and submit to federal custody pending investigation of these charges. You sanctimonious fool, Donovan snarled. You think that woman's testimony will stop at corruption charges? She knows about your involvement in half the schemes we've operated. The desperate accusation hung in the night air like an unexploded bomb. Crawford's silence suggested Donovan's claims held uncomfortable truth, creating exactly the leverage Thomas needed for future negotiations. Marshal Crawford, Thomas called out diplomatically, perhaps we should discuss these matters privately. I believe we may have mutual interests in resolving this situation quietly and professionally. Elizabeth smiled at Thomas's masterful handling of the complex situation. He was offering Crawford an escape from potential scandal in exchange for recognition of territorial authority, exactly the kind of negotiated settlement they'd hoped to achieve. The standoff continued for several tense minutes as various parties assessed their positions and calculated their options. Finally, Crawford's voice carried the resignation of someone accepting inevitable compromise. Judge Morrison, I believe federal and territorial authorities should coordinate closely on this investigation. Perhaps we could discuss appropriate protocols for handling sensitive evidence and witness protection. Elizabeth felt a surge of triumph as she recognized the language of negotiated settlement. Crawford was agreeing to legitimize Thomas's organization in exchange for protection from Donovan's threatened revelations. An excellent suggestion, Marshal, Morrison replied formally. I believe Mr. Mitchell's organization has demonstrated both the capability and commitment necessary for such coordination. As dawn began to break over the Morrison ranch, Elizabeth realized they had achieved something unprecedented. the transformation of an outlaw organization into recognized territorial authority through a single night of carefully orchestrated confrontation. But their victory came at a cost that became apparent only as the immediate danger receded. Marcus Donovan, cornered and facing certain imprisonment, made one final desperate gambit that threatened to unravel everything they'd accomplished. "You think this is over?" Donovan called out, his voice carrying across the dawn-lit valley with the bitter edge of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Marshal Crawford may be willing to negotiate, but there are others who won't be so accommodating." Elizabeth felt ice forming in her stomach as she recognized the threat behind Donovan's words. "What others?" she called back, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Federal investigators who've been tracking territorial corruption. For months." Donovan's laugh was harsh with desperation. "Men who don't negotiate with criminals, regardless of how cleverly they disguise themselves as legitimate authorities." Thomas appeared at Elizabeth's side, his expression grim. "He's referring to the Special Commission Governor Harrison mentioned in his correspondence with Judge Morrison. Federal investigators with broader authority than territorial marshals." The revelation transformed their moment of triumph into renewed crisis. Elizabeth realized that while they'd successfully maneuvered Crawford into accepting their legitimacy, they now faced a more sophisticated threat that wouldn't be as easily manipulated. "How much time do we have?" she asked quietly. "Unknown," Thomas replied. "But if Donovan's information is accurate, we may have federal investigators arriving within days rather than weeks." Judge Morrison emerged from the barn, where he'd been documenting the night's events, his expression troubled. "I've been in correspondence with the federal commission Donovan mentioned. They're specifically investigating territorial judicial corruption, with particular focus on cases involving Indian affairs and military contracts." Elizabeth felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The same corruption we've been documenting in Donovan's operations. They're not just investigating him, they're investigating the entire system he's been part of. "Which means they'll be very interested in our evidence," Catherine added, joining their huddle, "but also very suspicious of how we acquired it and why we're presenting it now." Thomas studied the tactical situation with the same methodical approach he'd used to plan the night's confrontation. "We need to control the narrative before federal investigators arrive. Present our information in a way that positions us as part of the solution rather than part of the problem." Elizabeth's mind raced through possibilities, her strategic thinking now fully engaged despite her exhaustion. What if we don't wait for them to come to us? What if we proactively contact the Federal Commission and offer to cooperate with their investigation? "That's an enormous risk," Morrison warned. "Federal investigators aren't as easily influenced as territorial marshals. They have resources and authority that could destroy us regardless of our evidence. But they also have objectives that align with ours," Elizabeth countered. "They want to eliminate corruption and establish effective governance in remote territories. We can provide both evidence and practical solutions they can't obtain elsewhere." Thomas nodded slowly, appreciation growing in his expression. "You're suggesting we offer to serve as their local enforcement arm in exchange for official recognition?" "Exactly. We've already demonstrated our capability to investigate and apprehend criminals. We've gathered evidence they need for their prosecutions, and we've established working relationships with territorial officials they need to coordinate with." Elizabeth felt excitement building as the strategy crystallized. "We offer them everything they need to succeed in exchange for the legitimacy we need to survive." Catherine looked skeptical. "Federal investigators aren't known for making deals with outlaw organizations, regardless of how helpful they might be. They are, however, known for making deals with effective local law enforcement," Elizabeth replied. The key is presenting ourselves as the latter rather than the former. Donovan's voice interrupted their planning. You can make all the deals you want. When federal investigators examine your operations, they'll discover the truth about Thomas Mitchell's background: military desertion, theft of government property, conspiracy against federal authority. Elizabeth felt Thomas tense beside her. This was information Donovan shouldn't have possessed, suggesting intelligence networks more sophisticated than they'd realized. How does he know about your military service? She asked quietly. Someone's been researching our backgrounds thoroughly, Thomas replied grimly. Which means we're facing more than just territorial corruption investigations. Someone's been building a comprehensive case against our entire organization. Judge Morrison's expression grew alarmed. If federal investigators already have detailed intelligence about your operations, proactive cooperation might not be sufficient to secure legitimacy. Elizabeth studied the dawn-lit landscape, noting how the revealing light transformed familiar terrain into something strange and potentially dangerous. Then we need to change the terms of engagement entirely. Instead of seeking legitimacy from federal authorities, we need to demonstrate that federal authorities require our cooperation to achieve their objectives, meaning we control evidence and intelligence they can't obtain elsewhere. We provide services they can't duplicate. We offer solutions to problems they can't solve independently. Elizabeth turned to face Thomas directly. We make ourselves indispensable rather than merely useful. Thomas's smile was both admiring and concerned. You're proposing to leverage our value rather than simply offering it. I'm proposing to negotiate. From a position of strength rather than weakness, Elizabeth corrected. Federal investigators need us more than we need them, but only if we maintain control of the resources they require. Donovan's voice rang out again, this time with desperate urgency. Marshal Crawford, you need to understand what you're dealing with. Thomas Mitchell isn't just an outlaw. He's a federal fugitive. The evidence is in his military records. Crawford's response was barely audible, but Elizabeth caught the tone of someone realizing he'd been maneuvered into a position far more complex than he'd anticipated. Judge Morrison, I believe we need to discuss these matters privately and immediately. Elizabeth watched as the various parties began repositioning themselves for what she realized would be a much more complex negotiation than any of them had anticipated. The night's confrontation had been merely the opening gambit in a longer game, involving federal investigators, territorial authorities, and outlaw organizations competing for control of Colorado's political future. Mrs. Harper, Thomas said quietly, I believe your real education in frontier politics is just beginning. Are you prepared for what comes next? Elizabeth looked around at the people who'd become her allies, the evidence they'd gathered, and the opportunities they'd created through careful planning and desperate courage. Mr. Mitchell, I've spent my entire adult life preparing for work that would allow me to use my talents for something meaningful. This is that work. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the forces gathering around them, Elizabeth felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge combined with genuine purpose. Whatever came next, she would face it with the confidence that comes from finally understanding who you are and what you're capable of achieving. The transformation from widowed teacher to political strategist was complete. Now came the test of whether that transformation would prove sufficient for the challenges ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.